Welcome to my talk on improving low connectivity experiences on the web. I'm Valerie Woolard Srinivasan. I work as a software engineer at Panoply, which is a podcast network. I'd be happy to offer all of my podcast recommendations to you if you catch me in the hallway later. But first I want to talk to you a little bit about the internet. I got really self-conscious when everyone had such great animal stuff in their presentations this morning, so I panicked and just added a bunch of random animal slides. So let's get started. The internet. We all love the internet. We've wasted many, many hours online. I'm willing to bet every single one of us. I'm also willing to guess that most people in this room have access to a reliable internet connection or on a regular basis, whether that's at home, at work, or both. The FCC defines high-speed internet as a connection with a speed of 25 megabits per second or higher. As of a year ago, 73% of adults in the United States had high-speed internet access at home. And that's a pretty good percentage, but if you think about it, it still leaves out an awful lot of people. According to the FCC, 10% of Americans lack access to broadband. That is, it's not even available for them to purchase. This can be especially pronounced in rural areas. In rural areas, 39% of people lack access to broadband. 20% of people in rural areas lack access to internet speeds of at least 4 megabits per second, which is more than 5 times slower, as we noted, than the FCC's definition of high speed, which is 25 megabits per second. 41% of people living on tribal lands lack high-speed internet. 66% of people in U.S. territories, 98% of people living in rural areas in U.S. territories. Now, I said that pretty fast, so I want to say that again. 98% of people living in rural areas in U.S. territories lack high-speed internet access. 12% of adults don't have high-speed internet but do use smartphones, and 21% of adults making under $30,000 a year fall into that category. Now, this is all to say, even though high-speed internet is probably a given for all of us, it's definitely not a given throughout the world or even throughout this country. High-speed internet is not at all equally distributed throughout the globe. The International Telecommunication Union 2017 report estimates that 54% of households worldwide have internet access, only 43% in developing countries, and only 15%, that's 1/5, in least developed countries. So perhaps then it goes without saying that the more forgiving your applications or websites are to people who have slow or limited internet access, the more people will actually be able to use them, opening up additional possibilities for viewers or customers from around the globe. It's also worth noting the regional and economic variations in internet accessibility, and keeping in mind that internet speed could be a hurdle to people in lower income brackets or from rural areas to using your site. These facts are all via the Pew Research Institute, the Federal Communications Commission, and the International Telecommunication Union, which is an agency of the United Nations. I'll have links in the presentation that I post later. There's a lot more interesting data on this, and I'd encourage you to dig in more if you're interested. I mentioned that I work at a podcasting company and therefore very often make the typo podcat. So I have a really fun Slack auto response that whenever someone uses podcat, posts this lovely picture. Let's talk about the different ways people can be internet limited. People may fall into multiple of these categories, and they may not be permanent or apply to all of the ways in which a person accesses the internet. First, there's the intermittent connection. This could be a fixed internet access point that is unreliable due to service providers or weather. It could also be a user who is using their phone to access the internet on the metro and going in and out of service areas. In these cases, the phone or computer may even say it's connected to a network, but packets aren't actually being delivered. Next, there's the slow connection, where a reliable connection exists, but it may be much slower than what we're used to or what the sites that the user is trying to access are optimized for, making it difficult to load websites with lots of rich content or background scripts. There's also the bandwidth limited connection, which again we're probably much more familiar with on our phones, where we have probably data limits, but also exists on some home internet plans. Some users may be limited to a certain number of gigabytes of data use a month, making them have a much higher awareness of how much bandwidth their internet use habits are actually consuming. Some people may also have sporadic or time-limited connections, which I've differentiated from the intermittent connections in that they're more predictable, such as a person who only connects to the internet when at work or a library, but may want to cache content there for use later. So let's talk about an example. Here's a picture taken near my parents' house. As I mentioned in my fun fact, I grew up in rural California. As you might guess, they're part of that statistic that lacks access to high-speed internet. There are no fiber or DSL lines up here. What there is a clear view of the southern sky. So they get a satellite internet with a top speed of 5 megabits per second for probably more than some of you pay for your much cushier plans. To top it off, they also have bandwidth caps that limit their total data usage to 10 gigabytes per month. Here's a full list of the internet plans from an internet provider available for my parents' zip code. You'll notice that the top download speed is 5 megabits per second, which is much lower than the 25 megabits per second required for the FCC's classification of high speed. You'll also notice that all of the plans have fairly low bandwidth limits, if you consider that streaming a movie could easily consume a gigabyte of data. My phone tracks data usage over Wi-Fi, and I looked for the last 30 days. I had used 15 gigabytes of data just on my home Wi-Fi network on my phone in the last month, with 7 gigabytes of that in my podcasting app. So the bottom plan here would be sufficient for just my podcast needs on my phone. If I wanted to be able to support all of the other idle browsing I do on my phone, I would need the middle plan. That's before you even get into the data I use on any of my other devices. But unlimited data usage from midnight to 5 a.m., so you can get all your downloading done then. The limitations of this plan fall into 3 of the categories that I mentioned in the earlier slide. One, it's slower than we're all used to. It's bandwidth limited, and it's time limited in that there's a time window where it's advantageous to get most of your data transfers done. So with these constraints in mind, let's continue. This is from a story in the New York Times in August 2015 entitled "The Cost of Mobile Ads on 50 News Sites." It was focusing on the cost of loading these sites for mobile users, both in terms of literal costs on their phone plans and in terms of time. As we've seen, a lot of the challenges that apply to mobile internet usage are also relevant to other limited connectivity users. It found that most news sites took longer to load ad content than editorial content, and in some egregious examples, that was up to 3 times longer. Given that these sites rely heavily on advertising for their revenue, it also doesn't seem like a good idea for ad scripts or content to reduce speed to such a level that it incentivizes the use of ad blockers. This is an important point to consider also as we consider advertising within our projects and the larger question of whether the cost to the user of viewing or using our content is being spent in loading content that is integral to what the app does, or whether it's added features, fun, or polish. If the things that we're making users load or download aren't essential, we should probably give them some way to opt out of them. This company, Activate, which does international web development, has a website site with lots of guidelines on how to better structure content for low bandwidth connections, and a lot more detail on how to implement some of these suggestions. Some of the ways you can help build low bandwidth friendly sites is to structure your pages in order of priority. So that way the most important content will load first, even if the user has to wait for other parts of the page to load. Another suggestion is to signal and allow people to opt out of high bandwidth portions of your site. From both a bandwidth and user experience perspective, for example, audio playing videos are not a thing that should ever happen. Users should know anytime they're about to download a file, you can use a little download symbol and indicate the file size if possible. It should be clear to users when they're about to start playing a video or stream, which again, you should never ever autoplay. Also try to optimize your caching and get familiar with what cache headers you're setting, making users avoid having to load the same content over and over again if it hasn't changed. Lastly, but perhaps most importantly, try to keep your pages small to begin with. Scale down images, store CSS in external style sheets instead of inline, avoid PDFs wherever possible, and embed that information in a web page. This company recommends a maximum page size with 25 kilobytes, with the rationale that such a page would take 10 seconds to load over a 20 kilobit per second connection, but that's pretty small. I think they took that benchmark based on the speeds of university internet connections in Africa, African universities. But I tried loading some common sites in Chrome DevTools, and all of them were at least a couple hundred kilobytes. Plenty went into the megabytes. The network tab in Chrome DevTools can help you with profiling this. If you go into DevTools, go to the Networks tab, click Disable Caching, and just hit refresh on a page. It'll give you the total amount of data transferred. You can also use Google's Page Speed Insights, which you can take a URL, and it'll give you suggestions for how to optimize the speed of that page. This site that I've linked below has links for tools to optimize your JavaScript and CSS to increase page speed. It also has a low bandwidth simulator, so you can get an idea of how low bandwidth users might be experiencing your site. And the recommendations that they have around page loading speed have to do with research that's been done into human cognition and when people will kind of give up on your site. They found that if they don't see anything within 10 seconds or so, they'll probably click away or lose interest. But if you can get some content on the page in the first couple seconds, the rest of the page can take longer to load. So it's not like you need to have all of your content fully loaded for those low bandwidth users in a 10 or 20 second time frame, but to have some useful information on the page during that time period is really important. In light of the recommendation that pages be no longer larger than 25 kilobytes, let's look at some common libraries. jQuery clocks in at 85 kilobytes. Bootstraps.js is 50 kilobytes, while its CSS is another 125 kilobytes. Angular is 164 kilobytes, and D3 is 216 kilobytes. Of course, these are necessary parts of a lot of sites for various reasons, but it's worth being aware of the cost of these inclusions, especially as we consider that these are before we get to the size of any of the content of your site. So if you can reduce the number of these dependencies that you're using, it can be really helpful for those low bandwidth users. Here's me and my dog. Her name's Katie. She's not alive anymore because I'm 6 years old in this picture, but she was a very good dog. So the ideas we've talked about so far are helpful for people with slow internet connections or limited bandwidth. But what about the separate issue of an unreliable internet connection or one that says it's connected but isn't? There's a growing movement toward offline-first development, which assumes that a user does not have a connection and serves from a cache. Then if there is a connection, updated information can be fetched and rendered. This was mentioned earlier in that gun.js uses a paradigm similar to this. Email clients were probably some of the first applications to use this sort of model. Even if you aren't connected, you can see the messages downloaded from the last time you were online. You can even write messages that are queued up to be sent the next time you have a connection. This paradigm can also be applied to your sites and web apps. Lots of tools are available, such as service workers, remote storage, and offline databases. To make the process of developing offline first, these make the process of developing offline first easier. The idea of offline first is especially helpful to mobile users and others who might not be able to predict when they'll lose connection. Adding additional UI signals like Google Drive's make available offline function can be really helpful in these scenarios. Online and in the resources section of this talk, you'll find lots of resources around offline first and how to start using it. I highly recommend the article Designing Offline First Web Apps on a list apart as a primer on the topic and some of the best practices and ideas around it, as well as resources on how to contribute your ideas and learn more. The big idea is that being offline should be treated as a normal part of the life cycle and not something that should be treated as an exception or throw in error. This is my dog Carla. We adopted her like a couple years ago. She's my parents' dog, but she's very sweet. So before we part ways, I want to talk a bit more about why I think this topic is important. This quote is from a story on limited connectivity users, primarily those using only a phone, and their access to news sites. As you can imagine, as capabilities improve to make the most complex infographics with the most flashy and interactive features, keep in mind the users that you may be leaving behind as you make those choices. It's really easy to always want to be on the cutting edge, always working on the coolest technology, but we have to remember that that's all privileged in many places. And that's a quote from Aaron Williams, a graphics reporter at the Washington Post. From a pure business perspective, the best way to reach more customers is to make your product available and useful to more people. If your product, website, or app has 1 billion possible users, chances are good that some of them will be in the groups that we talked about earlier who have limited internet access, be that due to geographic limitations, economic limitations, or some combination of the two. It's also worth remembering that constant and reliable internet connectivity is a privilege, and that by leaving out those who don't have it, we're leaving out a specific segment of the population, largely rural and or low income. In the last year, we've been involved in a very heated exchange around the internet's role in shaping our country, our politics, and our policies. As we come to rely on the internet more and more in our daily lives, both in our logistics and in our decision making, we need to be aware of the consequences that making tools and information inaccessible to low connectivity users has. Access to legitimate news sources was a huge issue in the last election, and one that is likely to continue to loom large as time goes on. We look specifically here at news sites and the toll that advertising scripts can take on low connectivity users. If those users aren't able to load legitimate news content, then we have a huge problem. If services, applications, or tools are similarly unavailable to that group, we have a huge problem. Think about this and your responsibilities in this system as you develop websites and design tools for the future. I used this as the last slide in my last talk, and I'm trying to see how many times I can get away with reusing it. I love it. I hope that this has given you some perspective on the world of limited connectivity on the web and given you some steps that you can take to improve the accessibility of what you build for low connectivity users. Nothing else, I hope I have convinced you to never ever use an auto-playing video, and if that is all I've done, I consider it a success. I'll be posting the link to these slides on my Twitter shortly. My Twitter handle is Valerie Codes. so keep an eye out for that. Feel free to find me later or on Twitter with any questions. If you're interested in working for my company, Panoply, we are hiring, and I'd be happy to chat about that as well. Go forth and conquer.